Let me introduce myself. I'm Martin Sanchez-Jankowski, Yaki, and co-chair, well, I guess chair now, unfortunately, because Joe Myers, who the center's actually named after, passed away recently. So I'm the chair of the Myers Center for Research on Native American Issues. And I want to welcome you all to today's colloquium. I first want to say that we're co-sponsoring this with the Sociology Department, so clearly thanks go out to them. As well as you'll notice that we're in Anthony Hall, which is now the Native American Community Center. I want to just thank the staff for actually hosting us here as well. If I could remind you, I have to always remind myself to look at my cell phone and turn it on silent because we're in quite a small space, and even though I know you would rush to turn it off, it still is a little bit disrupting. We couldn't be more appropriate to say that given our talk and given our subject matter, that today's event is taking place on unceded land of the Ohlone people, as is most places in America, as we celebrate Thanksgiving of all things. And given that, and also I want to draw your attention to a publication that the Myers Center has just put out, and it's available to everybody. And I think we may have some copies in the back. This is entitled "The University of California Land Grab, A Legacy of Profit from Indigenous Land." So I invite you to take a look at that publication either now after after the event or sometime in the future. The report has, of course, what we've learned from things and also some recommendations. So it's not simply a critique of what things that we're well aware of. Now, today's format will be that Professor George will address us for about 45 minutes, and that will, or more or less, as she's told me, and then we'll have chances for questions afterwards, at which time I'll come back from a seat up here, and if you just raise your hand, I'll just write it down so that she just doesn't have to show partiality or anything else and worry about any kind of negative repercussions. She just has to answer the question. Well, today's speaker is Professor Blythe George, who is a member of the Yurok Nation and holds a PhD in sociology and social policy from Harvard University. Last year, she was a UC Presidential Fellow here on campus in the Sociology Department, and currently she is Assistant Professor of Sociology at the University of California at Merced. Her talk today is entitled "Concentrated Trauma and the Reservation Effect." Please join me in welcoming Professor.
Well, thank you so much, everybody. I would be remiss if I didn't say this is exhilarating. I'm one of those sickos that actually likes public speaking, so I would be excited to be here no matter what. But this is the first time I've been able to present on my work in person in 2 years, actually, since my defense. And I'm happy to be here. I'm also, I'm feeling the space, and thank you so much for that amazing introduction. That shaves a little off the top at least. Yes, without further ado, I'm going to jump in. Now, when most people think of a reservation, they have questions more than answers. What is a reservation? What does it mean to be on or off reservation? Are there physical boundaries or other indicators of one side of the line or the other? Who lives there? Do non-tribal people live on the reservation? What are the rules and the laws that apply on the res? Over the course of my presentation, I will answer many of these questions and introduce several more. But there is one takeaway that I hope you leave this presentation with: how deeply important reservations are to those who love them, and how these spaces deserve to be spoken of with respect, not disdain nor pity. The reservation is both a space of deep meaning and a multi-layered structure in the lives of tribal peoples. For my tribe, the Yurok, and the neighboring Hoopa, we are some of the few land-based tribes in the state of California, meaning that we have our own land held in trust by the federal government, which is rare given the virtual theft of tribal lands in the state through unratified treaties in the 1900s. Our reservations have a unique and intertwined histories, even as they were once referred to as concentration camps and were places where people actively fled festering conditions of genocide, starvation, and indentured servitude. They're also smack dab in the center of our ancestral territories. Quite simply, we have always known this place, and it has always known us. We are of this place, as the Pulakwa and the Nur. Unlike other reservations, we are not constrained to pieces of land far from our sacred landscapes. Instead, we have access to some of our most sacred places within the bounds of our reservations. For those who live downriver in the most remote portions of the reservation, this is particularly the case as those living throughout the area seek out these spaces for ceremony and subsistence, both communal and individual. In our worldview, the landscape is living and interactive, with its stewardship providing a source of deep meaning and spirituality for those who dwell there. Despite this sacred nature and its centrality to our worldview as world renewal peoples, and maybe even because of it, the reservation is also the space where our trauma as invaded Indigenous peoples has accumulated across time and over generations. To theorize head-on this juxtaposition between the sacred and the profane that exists on the reservation, I posit the concept of the reservation effect. Now, the reservation, like I said, there's a lot of questions around it just generally, because it's not a place that, unless you're from it, you're probably really well familiar with. You need to know, though, that the reservation is actually an artificial space that in many ways was constructed for our demise. I don't think when the first reservation was made, they thought they would still be here. They actually wanted us to be there, and they starved us and killed anyone who ran away for a reason. But there are also places where tribal families have lived for generations, and in the case of the Yurok and Hoopa Valley reservations, since time immemorial. You know, in many ways, the reservation is a deceptively simple concept, and my analysis is only a first step in considering this space as a social institution. In the most straightforward terms, a reservation refers to tracts of land held in trust for federally recognized tribes. In trust refers to the fact that the federal government maintains a legal title and jurisdiction over the land, with the associated tribe responsible for local governance. As domestic dependent nations, tribal governments are analogous to their federal counterparts and administer a variety of services for their enrolled citizens and non-enrolled reservation residents alike. Most reservations are located far from urban areas, and in the case of removal, there are parcels of land set aside for tribes relocated to the area, as seen in Oklahoma, the Dakotas, and Montana. Now, these areas were usually distinguished by subpar physical conditions as compared to neighboring areas, further compounding their remote nature. Yet for some tribes, reservations are located within their ancestral homelands, as is the case with the study area. In this way, although the Yurok and Hoopa Valley reservations comprise only a portion of the original territories of the Yurok and Hoopa peoples, they exist within the context of these tribes' most sacred landscapes, a distinction that makes their location particularly meaningful. Now, while anyone can live on a reservation, a tribe that governs a specific reservation has legal jurisdictions over the land and occupants therein. As such, the tribe maintains sovereignty over the land and can define its legal use for all inhabitants. Most reservations are a mix of both tribal and non-tribal residents as results of decades of land disenfranchisement, including the Allotment Act of 1887. Few man-made boundaries exist to demarcate reservations, with most characterized by a rich flow of people and resources to and from their surrounding areas. Now, by providing this background information and focusing on tribal reservations in particular, I offer sociologists an additional lens and a new context in which to study many of the social phenomena we study elsewhere. In particular, I ask, how do we explain the simultaneous existence of the sacred and the profane on tribal reservations? Now, I guess I should show you a picture of this place I've been talking about. This is where I'm from, about 6 hours north of us in the Yurok and Hoopa Valley tribal reservations. Now, a little bit about myself. As Martine said, I am a member of the Yurok tribe. I grew up off reservation. That's really important to point out. You know, the positionality of the researcher comes into play in many ways. But for me, you know, I remember being so almost envious of the people I knew who were from the reservation growing up, because I knew there was deep pride to say they came from there, and there was roots that were so deep. And coming from off reservation, I knew that there was a reason why my family lived there and not on res. But at the same time, even before, you know, I was asking these kinds of questions, I knew there was something special about this place. Even as from the outside looking in, there are some negative outcomes that also cluster there spatially. Now, in order to answer the question, it's important to acknowledge also that I operate within a fundamentally community-based participatory research model. That's a fundamental component of just how I move as a scholar activist, I like to say. It's really important to me that as much as I've had, you know, all kinds of training, I've got these eyes, a sociologist toolkit, you know, I also know there's a lot of knowledge and important wisdom in the community I'm studying, and I need to be open to that and actually lean into that knowledge. And so I partner with, in particular, the Yurok Justice Center and the Tribal Court for the bulk of this work. You're going to see quite a bit of quotes today. I do, as a qualitative sociologist, I do primarily interviews as well as ethnography. And so those interviews are ensconced within approximately 30 months of ethnographic observation, comprising over 1,000 plus exposure hours. This ranged from, as I said, the Justice Center and Tribal Court, seasonal dance observations, as well as the festivals, funerals, and free time in between. Now, like I said, I'm from this place. So it's really kind of weird to say I've got 1,000 plus exposure hours to home, but you have to realize that I set aside that credential and return to this place to try and appreciate it with those newfound eyes. And that's what this draws from. I'm actually right now in the process of working on my manuscript, right? Because it's not a dissertation anymore. I'm a doctor. But yes, I'm hoping that what you're here today, you'll actually end up seeing in print in the near future. But I'm drawing from 35 cases. The population of study in particular was tribal fathers with criminal records. This was to have a theoretical corollary to what we know when it comes to inequality, stratification, and neighborhood effects, right? Generally speaking, we focused on marginalized communities and those most impacted by those obstacles, often being unskilled, low-skilled men who may or may not have criminal records. For me, I wanted a hook. I wanted to hook into all those things, and these respondents, these participants, were that hook. Now, you can't just go out and ask, you know, tribal fathers with criminal records questions. It's actually a really painstaking, over a year-long process of building a database of eligible participants, because when it comes to just even talking about mass incarceration or inequality in Indian country, these are numbers we're still trying to get a handle on. And so I had to build that data set before I could start asking my own qualitative questions. I'd be happy to answer any questions about that, because database creation and management is one of the things very near and dear to my heart and very important for Indian country. Now, I also adopt a modified grounded theory approach, which means, you know, going back to what I said earlier, I feel like if I were to only see what the theories of sociology want me to see, I wouldn't see everything. I would actually be missing a lot. And so it's really important to me that as much as I came in, you know, with certain questions in mind based on what we'd observed elsewhere, I also let the field speak to me, and there was that iterative flow that manifested in a variety of ways, you know, making sure I was hitting saturation on my key themes, adjusting my sampling strategy accordingly, and I ended up with about 2/3 on-reservation participants and 1/3 off, although everyone had ties to a reservation community, either in the area or outside of it. Now, that returns us to our research question, just to give you a reminder. What is it that I'm trying to explain here? Now, I'm going to give you a peek at the answer, but we're going to go in depth. Basically, though, I'm saying the reservation effect is the juxtaposition of concentrated trauma with the sacred landscape and spirituality that live on reservation. This juxtaposition has implications for a plethora of outcomes at the individual and community levels, outcomes that are mediated by the character and organization of social ties on the reservation. Now, let me lay this on you. In some ways, I'm trying to overwhelm you a little with the complexity of this, this figure. Now, what I tried to do here was essentially map for the reader, the audience, the many connections between my participants. Now, you'd probably think, oh, sure, you interview a bunch of friends, they're all going to be connected. That's not what I did. I made an entire database. I randomly selected people, and from there, I employed referrals, but I ended up, it was almost like there was a net that already existed, and I picked up one piece, and it all came with it, because the ties between my participants and their community members were many and overlapping, so much so that, I didn't realize what I'd stumbled into, even as someone who's from this community, the many ways people could be connected, even in different locations. I don't have a pointer, but you can see out here on the coast, we have someone, Xavier is a focal character throughout the narrative. And he has friends downriver, friends and bunkmates, as in maybe they were at the Humboldt County Hilton or the local jail a time or two together. They also were part of dance camps, which meant they came together every summer, danced with regalia, shared that space together. They also might be cousins, extended kin, which means we know we're cousins, but we don't know how. All these different ways people were connected. Foster family, baby cousins, and recovery. Now, these were all different kinds of social connections, but the overwhelming number, character, and flavor of them was just different, I would say, than what we have typically observed in communities that have experienced historical marginalization. Now, what I observe is neither strong nor weak ties, but thick ties on the reservation. Now, the sociologists in the room will realize this is an homage to Granovetter's strong or weak ties hypothesis, right? That we know that, one would think that the people you know really well are the people that will result in let's say, a job referral, right? But really, actually, it's the people you know a little more casually that can cast that wider net. That expression, it's not what you know, it's who you know. This has been tested in many different ways. And so we as sociologists have certain ways of conceiving of the ties between people. And for my case, that did not resonate. That was because the ties in this case, the ties that characterize social organization on the reservation are neither strong nor weak, but rather thick ties that cut both ways. Now, we're going to talk over the course of the presentation what I mean when I say cut both ways, but essentially I mean there's good and bad things that come with these incredibly thick ties. Now, the social organization on the reservation was characterized by acquaintance density and multiplexity. Basically, acquaintance density is a fancy way to say everyone knows everyone. Coming from this place, I always heard that, but my previous diagram kind of shows you it can be true. And in a rural place where there's only so many people, we also have a phenomenon called multiplexity, which means that the roles that any of us play to the other community members are multiple and overlapping. Your banker might be your dance camp leader. They might be the football coach. There's all these different purposes and roles that they serve in your life that in a community with just more bodies in the room, it would be spread out. And instead, in this community, we see a real a multiplexity of ties. Now, what was interesting, though, was as much as my participants were very cognizant of the social resources they had access to by virtue of their backgrounds, it was all they could do. They never liked asking for help. Instead, they much preferred being the central points. Now, this goes back to our traditional understandings of generosity and community and how those expectations in particular were honored by men. Again, I was speaking to male participants, but there was almost an extreme aversion to ask for help, but a selflessness and a shirt off your back ethos that actually we'll talk more about later, because you're like, well, what does that mean? If you can't ask for help, does that mean people offer? Quite quite likely, but let me get there. Now, well, when it comes to this kind of central point, I have Elijah here. He says, I just try to be that person where they can kind of not look up to, but just kind of like a role model in how I raise my family, taking the kids to school, staying away from drugs and alcohol. You know, just be like that kind of, you know, not like a pillar, but just like that person where they're like, well, cousin Elijah's doing it. Well, why can't I do it? Now, as a reminder, these are pseudonyms to protect the confidentiality and privacy of the participants. But Elijah here is kind of describing this central point preference, that they want to be that person that people can look up to, even though he doesn't want to say it. He hesitates, but in many ways, that's who he was trying to be. He actually thought of his father or his Pichawus when he was thinking of who he wanted to be and who he wanted to be able to be to support his family and his social networks. Now, as I said, others like Mason, you know, this might be Mason's word, but this quote was emblematic of almost every man in my sample. I'm not the kind of guy that can ask, but I'm always that guy that will do whatever it takes to help. Now, in many ways, I feel like sometimes this work is, you know, like, God, shouldn't you want to help? Like, that seems kind of obvious. What are you telling me about this for? Well, it's because in marginalized communities, and you know, the lion's share of the literature on that, there has been, you know, documented evidence of the kind of alienation of the social ties between individuals. Social isolation, in fact, being one of the big drivers to all these negative outcomes we see in present day. I actually came across a case where, like, our social networks are on 100. We have so much there, and you know, that's what I'm going to spend some more time telling you about. But you have to realize I'm pushing back on literature that essentially says that if you live in a context of 30%, 40% poverty, unemployment rates over 80 to 90%, that in a community like this, where the average Yurok is 11 times more likely to go to jail in a given year than the non-Yurok, you know, you shouldn't have these rich social ties, and particularly if you're one of those guys in and out of jail, you shouldn't have them. That's not what I found. Now, I found that the ties on reservation were actually vital for social and material support, immensely so, particularly in the case of housing, multi-generational homes, family land. For example, if your family has land, maybe they're the only ones who can actually live on it, but if you can get a trailer, if you can get an RV, you have a place to live. Doubling up, not an ideal scenario by any means, but nonetheless, these were one of the ways that on reservation in particular, individuals would pool resources, socially support one another through the provision of housing. For example, Isaac says, you know, my wife got pregnant and we decided to move home because I figured I'd have a little more supported home at my mom's house than I would alone. And so that's exactly why we moved home. She'd gotten pregnant just after a few months of being together. And, you know, I knew that I needed the support from my family back home on the river. Living down at Pequot on the reservation is a beautiful place to raise kids, right? It's pretty safe. You get a huge yard. The cost of living is not that much. I can say that at Pequot, I've never had to pay rent. You don't have to pay electricity. Food is there. You know, Mom always has the fridge. And so that's why we moved up there. Now, Pequot, you have to realize, Pequot is essentially at the end of the road somewhere. If you know this part of the world, it literally stops. But there are people who crave that space, who work day in and day out to cultivate a space to care for their family, off-grid subsistence lifestyle, and it's something they take great pride in. And you know, sometimes when you're out there, like, this is hard work. I don't know why. Why? Because it means something to them, and it's something that actually, if they're lucky, their families have always done since time immemorial. It just looks and feels a little different. Isaac came from one of those families, and you know, when he knew he needed help, he knew that's where he could go, home to the res. Now, job referrals, I kind of touched on earlier, this idea of who you know. I actually, you know, going back to this idea of what we know about social ties in marginalized communities, Sandra Smith's work, for example, has really spoken to the fact that, you know, there are social networks, there is social capital, but there's something going on with social capital mobilization that limits the ability to actualize one's social connections into tangible employment outcomes. Now, going back to, I said that these guys never like asking for help, which is kind of like the defensive individualism we know about elsewhere. I observed what I'm calling a process of generosity of position. The traditional expectation of male generosity informs a process by which men help those their junior look for work, like sons, baby cousins, and little brothers with little prompting, and in turn, benefit from similar generosities from those their senior, like fathers, uncles, and grandfathers. Well-placed female kin working in the tribal environment also facilitated the transmission of job knowledge, yet the heavily gendered nature of the men's preferred occupations in fire, fisheries, and forestry meant that male job holders were more frequently in the position to broker job information than their female family members. Going further, the few jobs still available in natural resources industries rely heavily on word-of-mouth referrals. Given the danger of some of these positions, men were only hired in the event that another could vouch for them personally. Now, this is another example of social networks working exactly how we would expect them to work. Actually working incredibly well, because a lot of my respondents, they weren't exactly, what was really hard was they often had a plethora of job skills. Things, being able to stand on a landing with logs as big as a car and not get squished. I don't have that skill, I'm pretty sure. Thankfully, I picked books. But like there's a bodily knowledge, there's a cat-like reflex, there's a whole level there that they would have access to, but because they'd have violent criminal histories, because they were recently in recovery, there was reasons why employers, maybe they weren't their first pass through the stack, but if they had someone who could help them get their foot in the door, again, as we've seen elsewhere, the job referral works, the social network is working. Now they're also working when it comes to recovery and ceremony. Now, in many ways, oh God, this is what you get from the notes. Here we go. Such ties, right? I'm saying they can be these immense sources of support for recovery. Sober networks were actually how many found their way back to living in a good way. And it was often by capitalizing on family, ceremony, and spiritual ties that spanned generations. Now, this is because generativity, which means kind of building the resources of the future generations, as well as male accountability. These things went hand in hand for world renewal men. This meant that there was certain ceremonies, certain practices men did together that they held one another accountable through. There was a man space. Granted, as a woman trying to study these things, there was only certain things I could get access to because there's a whole network that was gender-based that was facilitating recovery on the reservation. In many ways, they almost came to recovery like links in a chain. One pard or partner, as they would say, one pard after the other. And in many ways, and I'm going to start talking now about some not so positive outcomes. We know too that networks are fundamental to using ties. If you're someone who struggles with substance use disorder, if your friends also use, it can be difficult to stay sober. If that's the nature of social ties and recovery, both positively and negatively, right? Cutting both ways. Now, what I have done here is purposefully, before I transition, I want to speak to Orion real quick. He says, I think it makes me even more strong because I don't have to be elsewhere to be in recovery. I think that's the stronger point, because I can come back and do it here where I have all this bad stuff that's happened here and all the bad influences that are here, and I can still overcome those things. Now, Orion was a leader in the recovery community in Hoopa, and he had at one point been addicted to heroin, and before that, OxyContin. Now, I'm going to tell you about those things shortly. I could have started there. I did not for a reason. You can, unfortunately, a lot of times when people talk about the reservation, they go straight to the bad stuff. I'm not trying to do that poverty-porn stuff, but I am going to bring some complicated and triggering subjects to all of you, and I will try and flag that as I do in case any of our viewers at home or anyone would like to step out. But But here, Orion is hinting at the fact that on the reservation, even as much pride as he takes that he can be there and be sober, even when he definitely wasn't sober for a while, there's something living side by side. The meaning and the sacred being right by the profane, right? And that's because the ties could also be ties to trauma and tragedy. Now, these ties could be connections by which individuals were exposed to the trauma of their social network partners, trauma that further exacerbates their own contemporary, intergenerational, and historical traumas. So this is the concentrated trauma component. I'm going to go through each of these in turn, but it's important to note that I see these as a cumulative, overlapping, multiplying effect. That as a first order concern, any of the traumatic experiences of my participants were taking place within a multi-generational historical context of trauma. That they, as Indigenous peoples, had been in the crosshairs of the settler-colonial project since before they were born. And so that meant that even as we're still trying to figure out how to conceptualize these from a theory way, they are living with the implications of concentrated trauma in real time. Now for us, we had legacies of the boarding schools. Genocide is a backdrop. The way that California was settled was particularly egregious. I will be happy to answer any questions about that. But I heard a statistic once that 2 out of 3 natives were killed in the state in the 2 years after the discovery of gold. And I mean, that's extreme. That means that anyone who is Indigenous now in the state is a descendant of a genocide survivor. And, you know, as if that wasn't enough, we had boarding schools, right? We too, boarding schools have been in the news. I don't think I need to belabor that point. But as they are now the sites of mass grave investigations, the boarding schools clearly had their own traumas. And the indentured slavery, which is not something a lot of people know about in California, even after the Civil War, there were Indigenous people who were enslaved in California under the guise of indentured servitude. They would essentially trap children in the forest and sell them into slavery. Now, for us, we referred to these people as the short-haired generation. This was in reference to their short hair as a result of having it cut at boarding schools, or of just having to cut it to assimilate. And for Raymond, his family was from Smith River, and he says, I've danced in the pit when I was a kid, when I was 6. I don't know no songs or nothing. No one, like my grandma, I don't know. She's an old timer. It was kind of like frowned upon back in the day, you know what I mean? So like the Tolowa Nation, their language is coming back. They've got books and stuff. But the way Raymond says this, you can tell like he has a little bit of shame, quite frankly, around the fact that he doesn't come from a dance family. He doesn't have songs. Some of my participants did, and then some. But he also was very cognizant of why that was the case. That his grandma had certain experiences. And now he says here, he was actually raised by his grandma. And so that's pretty common in many tribal communities to have grandma. If they're not the primary caretaker, they are for sure a very important part of their lives. And there's an intergenerational transmission of knowledge there that means that I have proximity to the experiences of my grandparents because I have proximity to my grandparents. My knowledge and my blood knowledge is informed by them, and when they're an important part of your lives, that's only more so the case, right? Now, what does this mean for the people who came home? Essentially, the ones who came back from boarding school, the people who came back from being enslaved, because we know not everyone did, but the ones who did, they came home with the marks of settler colonialism on them, within them, that in turn cascaded into some of our most intimate relationships, the relationships between partners, between parents and children, right? These intimate connections, these family bonds were directly, they too were in the crosshairs, right? And so everything was geared towards severing them. It's not surprising that the people who made it home came back with certain behaviors that were not helpful or productive. That's a very clean way of saying it, sanitized way. But I'm talking in particular about child abuse, domestic and intimate partner violence. I am going to share some quotes in the next slide that do deal with that, so this would be a good time if you would like to come back in a couple of minutes. You know, child abuse, domestic, intimate partner violence. I've always been struck at how, particularly domestic violence, I remember when I was getting my dissertation ready, prospectus phase, flashbacks, all the way back then, I wanted to study domestic violence, and I was told that it wasn't sociology. Yeah, that it wasn't sociological enough. And that was, at the same time, I'd come across this citation that said that it's the most common and pervasive form of violence in the world. And so yes, don't get me wrong, at the prospectus phase, you can't push back too much. But I knew I was going to come back to that because in my community, it's far too frequent, but we also know where it starts, right? And there's a lot of healing that people are doing in real time to set down these behaviors, even as they may have engaged in them in their own lives or been abused. Now, for a man like Roman, whose family was from Blue Creek, he says, "My mom showed me love every day. She showed me emotion. She always had times when she kind of got drunk, but she'd apologize and tell me she wished she could have did more. But I watched her bust her ass every day. She worked her ass off and she earned like a lot of what she has. She came from an abusive, like her first marriage was really, really abusive. Like I've watched a lot of bad things happen, and my first memories are of bad things. When I was 4 years old, I remember seeing her get beat into a closet with a coat hanger and locked in there for days. When he described seeing his mother beaten into a closet, Roman's brow furrowed tightly as he wiped away angry tears, shaking his head and lamenting his mother's victimization. Such abuse was not restricted to his mother, however. Her boyfriends also physically abused the boys. One man poured salt and pepper into their eyes. He says, "I woke up once, me and my brother, with our eyes swelled shut because of salt and pepper poured in our eyes while we were sleeping. We had woke up early and we made cereal and didn't put up the cereal box. And our mom didn't know that that's what happened. She thought we had an allergic reaction and stuff. But we were so scared of this man that we didn't know how to tell her because she didn't want to see her get beat again. Because she always stuck up for us, like no matter what." So she's really a great woman. Now, I share these anecdotes to open the door to a discussion of trauma, contemporary trauma, right? I've talked about some really traumatic things, but that was all, multi-generational, historical, intergenerational. In real time, my respondents were also experiencing grievous trauma across the life course. There is a really awesome tool from psychology that I'm a big fan of. It's called the Adverse Childhood Experiences Survey, ACEs, your ACEs score, Essentially, this is a way to quantify trauma and in so doing, track the implications for a whole host of outcomes, whether it's brain function, academic performance, it's just health outcomes. There's just all these things that having a high ACE score is not good, and it's the effects are cumulative and overlapping, much like what I've described here. But it's often, at individual, one time, it's a very specific tool that counts things in a very specific way. And so if we do use it though, nearly 1 out of 3 of my off-reservation participants and almost half of on-reservation participants scored a 4 or higher when I retroactively assessed their life narratives with an ACEs score. Again, like I said, a high score is associated with a host of negative outcomes, and whether this was the fact that 75%, okay, I got all my stats together. Let's say 90% of my sample and over 100% of those on reservation identified as being in the process of recovery, some as recently as the last year. There was also comorbidity, refers to when things are co-occurring. For example, if you have a substance use disorder and you also have complex post-traumatic stress disorder, these things interact and require a treatment plan that is different than if we were addressing each of these things separately. This is, I would say it's probably pretty rare for someone not to have comorbidities, but in this sample, this was especially the case, that we were seeing an extremely high exposure to violence, particularly seeing both child abuse, but seeing their mothers be treated violently, which is actually one of the less common ACE experiences nationally, was almost universal for my sample. Now, this has implications because beyond the mental health and kind of substance use disorder at the individual level, we were also seeing outcomes at the community level. Now, Noah here describes when OxyContin first came to the valley. People, OxyContin is an opioid. It's used for pain management, and it's also featured in Dope Sick on Hulu, so that kind of steals my thunder a little. But here Noah says people started to see, okay, well, you can crush them up and you can snort them. And then there were a lot of people that were snorting them, and then once your tolerance changes to all these different ways, then people start smoking them, So they're using tinfoil to smoke them. And eventually, people are shooting them. And so what they say about OxyContin is it's like hillbilly heroin, Once people are shooting OxyContin, it's basically just like doing heroin. And indeed, that's what happened. Hoopa is right now, not just Hoopa, but the county, we're in the clutches of a heroin epidemic that is if it was just that, that'd be one thing, but this is only the most recent substance epidemic because it was predated by the OxyContin, which facilitated it. My tribe and others are actually actively litigating this with the manufacturers of these pills because they, again, dope sick if you really want the thing, but they undersold the addictive capacity and there are people dead because of it. My tribe is trying to address that, but in real time we have people that are getting sick and we're trying to heal ourselves. And for some, it couldn't happen fast enough. In 2016, the small communities of Wichipec, Tule Creek, and other downriver villages experienced a rash of suicides and other deaths. It was so dire that at one point the Yurok tribe declared a state of emergency on that part of the reservation after 6 people took their lives in the matter of months. With these 6 suicides plus other deaths, it was 10% of the small town's 150-person population. As if this was not terrible enough, the close-knit nature of on-reservation life, especially downriver, meant that most of the victims were blood relatives to each other and the larger community. In all of these instances, first responders were hours away, and family members, parents, siblings, partners, were left holding what remained of their loved ones. By comparison, 10% of the population in cities like Chicago or San Francisco would be tens to hundreds of thousands of people. In each instance, the loss of life on this scale is nothing short of catastrophic. I think that it would not be too much to say that if Oxy had never come to the valley, we would have never had that suicide emergency. Now, as a sociologist, I'm still trying to work the causal links out, but sometimes you can't prove what we know is true, and we're in a state now of just having to meet it head on. Now, this means then that the reservation is the collection point for constant cycles of grief and in turn concentrated trauma. Together, so if this is kind of what we're seeing take place on the reservation, I have skipped ahead. This is Anthony. When he talks about, I skipped ahead. I wanted to share this quote because Anthony was talking about essentially when his sister's house burned down, my sister started coming around real heavy, and then my brother's ex-old lady started coming around, and they were all just like getting all fucking loaded and tearing the house apart and acting like, they're just going to be high in front of me and my wife, and my mom was backing them up. And my mom has this habit when she gets too high, she just gets too fucking high. And then whoever she's hanging around, they're all buddies, and she doesn't really think about what's really going on. And they were all fucking buddies, and I don't put up with shit like that. Now, Anthony was living at his mom's house with his family, his wife and his daughter. They too had actually been meth users, but they they had found recovery. They actually were enrolled in the local community college. It was a time of prosperity for their family, but they still had to live at his mom's house, and so it didn't matter whether he and his wife were choosing to be sober. They, by virtue of the ties cutting both ways, the social resources, the housing, it sat side by side with the meth in this case, right? And so we have, now this is when I say this part, the reservation as the collection point for constant cycles of grief and in turn concentrated trauma. Now, the reservation effect is in equal measures sacred and profane, right? While adversity may have existed within the world renewal landscape, it was not until the imposition of the settler-colonial project and the concentrated trauma that accompanied it that the strong social bonds that bound individuals at the family and village levels became the same ties by which tragedy and violence ricocheted from node to node, irrespective of personal agency. Now, for some families, they were almost constantly in a state of grief. Roman, who we met earlier, talks about, he's talking about his mom and how she's an amazing woman, an awesome woman, fun, caring, loving, a badass, my friends would call her, the toughest woman they'd ever known. She didn't take no shit from anybody. She's a mama bear, a big mama bear. When we lost my brother, I lost my mom. That was the time when her back was going out. All those years of hard work, she had degenerative back disease, so her discs were going out and they started giving her morphine. Between that and losing my brother, it worked. She'd work her ass off all day at work still and come home in pain and just take what they said. And next thing you know, she'd be out. And that, who are we to say, unfortunately, the loss of a child for a parent is, right, I don't need to belabor that point as being incredibly devastating and a turning point. But on the reservation, it was tragically frequent. And it was so much so that the case that 1 out of 6 of the participants in my study had lost a child and actually pointed to it as a turning point in their lives, both for recovery, for a plethora of things, right? And but on the reservation, they were often just one of several families that had to navigate that grief. And when your family or the neighbors are grieving and these are the same people that have your back for everything else, you're grieving too, right? That grief, that tragedy, the trauma, it travels along those same lines. Now, Alexander, he talks about the kind of one of the outcroppings of this. I've learned in my life how to be cold, how to be hard-shelled. I haven't cried in, I don't even know how long. I don't shed tears for anything. I couldn't cry at my dad's funeral. I cried when my brother died. I cried when I lost my kids. But after that, the drugs completely took any and all of that away. And then I just became more and more numb. To this day, I'm still looking for those feelings. When Alexander was a teenager, he witnessed his brother commit suicide. It had implications for him to the day of our interview and well past it. And for him, when he would tell me about the things that he had experienced, who am I to judge how he chose to cope? Because we have to realize that for a lot of these guys, their substance use disorders, maybe they started in adolescence, youthful antics, what have you. But for those who have adverse childhood experiences, they interact differently with substances from the beginning, even ways that they might not appreciate. And Alexander at the time, he was in recovery and he was making moves to try and restore the things he realized he'd lost. But at the same time, he's still looking, right? Anthony, like I said, he'd gotten into community college and was actually really starting to piece all this together himself. If anything, he said, we've been drinking and using drugs, actively drinking for centuries upon centuries and centuries, right? So we're passing these genes down to our children. And these substances our genes are perceiving as survival methods. So I don't know, that's just a theory of mine. I had this theory that because we pass down genes from what it takes to survive, the fact that we're all drinking all the time, most of us, and using, whatever that our genes are like, passing it on like it's a survival in our genome. Now, Antony's not far off. We are just now, as scientists, catching up to the ways that trauma lives in the body, it lives in our DNA, and it's through a very complicated process, but it's happening nonetheless. And actually, Indigenous peoples, we've always known that the historical trauma is adding up, and thankfully we have tools, we have our medicine as a way to heal that, but we're just now getting to this place where we can appreciate this academically, scientifically, even as much as it's been historically at play. So what does this case teach us? Now, the reservation effect, in conclusion, it's juxtaposing implications for social organization and the negative outcomes that cluster on the reservation in present day are not an accumulation of contemporary circumstances nor historical marginalization. They are both in tandem, set within a context of an all-consuming settler-colonial project that has sought to sever the connection between us and the land, between one another, and with our very own well-being. Nevertheless, our social bonds persist and have been the lifeblood to preserving our way of life. By describing the character of these social bonds and the social organization in which they sit, as well as the conditions under which they are constantly assailed, I shine a light on a new way of thinking about the social ties that bind. Not strong or weak ties, but rather thick ties that extrapolate outcomes across a social network, and in this case, operate in the context of the reservation effect. So much of social organization theory in marginalized communities takes for granted an assumption that social ties are coming from a place of alienation, that the ties between individuals and households are so tenuous as a result of cumulative adversity that marks their communities, with few able to mobilize resources of any kind from their social connections. Yet in this case, I have shown that in fact, grievous outcomes can mark those social networks that are working incredibly well for meeting a variety of needs, be they subsistence, work, or ceremony. The social networks that live on the reservation are a deep source of vitality and resilience, but these are the same connections that have been constantly attacked through waves of genocide, polysubstance use epidemics, and mass incarceration and MMIW. We are bound together by these ties, so much so that the outcomes of individuals and the tragedies of any one node are extrapolated to the level of the network, with personal agency only one of multiple components shaping individual behaviors and community-level outcomes alike. By extension, it is not because our social connections are weak or strong that this happens, it's because they are thick, and perhaps such thickness is at play in other cases. When we marginalize a community for their very essence, whether it's their race, their class, their immigration status, or all of the above, adversity accumulates across a variety of indicators, and even the strongest ties are no panacea. In fact, my analysis complicates our portrayal of marginalized social ties by opening a new way of thinking of how thick ties between individuals can be the lines by which everyone burns, even as only a few feel the fire. Trauma is the stickiest and most pervasive inequality, and it has been exclusively reserved for certain communities over others. Reservations are one example of such concentrated trauma. Thankfully, they are also resilience incarnate. If they were not, we would not be here. And in many ways, they have been the ember of our resilience across time, even as so many have sought to snuff it out. Now, even as I describe the theoretical implications of this work, for me it begins and ends with the community I come from and how this work can be used to improve our quality of life. I've spoken today about the inequalities and marginalization that have impacted us for generations now, but I and the many others who call these areas home are living proof that even in the context of concentrated trauma, we can and will persist. What we need in order to thrive and not merely survive, however, is a reconceptualization of trauma responses from the individual level to that of the community. Psychology, neuroscience, and their peer disciplines have devoted entire labs to studying the effects of trauma on DNA, brain function, mesolimbic implications, health outcomes, and mental health conditions. Yet there has been scant consideration of the cumulative and multiplying impacts of trauma that's long-term, chronic, and/or experienced across generations at the community level. It is this rich consideration of the social context of trauma that sociology is best equipped to bring to light, and reservations are uniquely conditioned to speak to. By advocating for the need to describe and intervene in community trauma responses, I theorize a sociology of trauma, whereby the many individual and shared experiences of trauma that accumulate in marginalized communities are interpreted as phenomena sui generis, or traumas greater than the sum of their individual hurts. While scales and surveys can be very clean ways to assess trauma, to merely count what is incalculable is a missed opportunity for theory and policy intervention alike. As an Indigenous scholar, this is not an opportunity I nor my community can afford to miss, and I recount our trauma in the hopes of making way for our resilience and the resilience of future generations. Now, in many ways, I'm talking about the level of paradigm. There are so many lessons that these communities could teach us if we could heal, if we could help them heal, because we're all kin, people, place, environment. The sooner we figure this out, maybe we could have handled COVID. Maybe climate change could be addressed. The teachings that Indigenous people have always followed, I believe, will be the teachings that save us. I'm a little biased, but that's where I stand. And, for me, it comes back to the 7th generation perspective. We can't forget, and we won't forget what happened to those who came before us, because we are still thriving with the help of their prayers. Just like we won't forget the 7 generations from us that we hope will not be so impacted by the negative outcomes that plague us in present day. I also want to make a point about compassion. When we assume alienation, when we assume, the saying. And for me, there's always been a real lack of compassion for people who have substance use disorders, who might have violent criminal histories as a result of behaviors that could stem from a whole host of mental health conditions. And quite simply, as someone who loves these people, who comes from these people, we need to put some respect on their name. And I think that this is a case that shows us how that can be done. Now, for policy, send help, but stand back. Invest in place, but not paternalistically. I don't need the great white father to come save anyone. I need him to honor his trust obligations and send the money or give the land back. I actually totally would prefer the other, but I digress. I do say this, though, because a lot of our policy when it comes to social mobility, we often encourage people to maybe consider moving somewhere else where it isn't so hard. We're never leaving this place, so we need to figure out how to make it good. People shouldn't have to leave Hoopa to get healthy. They shouldn't have to leave Klamath to be sober, And we need to think of how to enrich these places in place. And again, as I said, we need to conceptualize community trauma responses. We think of trauma as an individual experience, and the sooner we realize it's something that's shared, I believe the closer we will be to actually healing. Walk loud for your consideration.
Well, I'm here to take questions. Yes.
I have a question about why you chose your population with the idea of men in criminal backgrounds, in the sense of are you trying to show that a lot of the criminal background is from this intergenerational trauma and mental health?
Yes, what's interesting is for my guys, the criminal, I'm actually not trying to explain criminal behavior. For me, my big question was, from the outside looking in with these unemployment rates, poverty rate, violence, and there's an assumption that Indians don't work. My family members have made certain choices in their lives, but that doesn't mean they didn't provide for me, and that I don't love them and they don't love me. And so I was more so coming from this place of men, and particularly marginalized fathers. We've spent a lot of time thinking about them, and I never saw men like the ones from my community represented. And that meant by extension then that policymakers weren't thinking of them when it came to if you are someone who is in the process of prisoner reentry And regardless of what got you there, if you want to make good and you want to provide for your family, we know you're doing it with one hand tied behind your back, right? But I knew on reservation people were still meeting that obligation to provide, and I wanted to kind of dig into that. That is a really good example, though, of how you start with one question and you wind up many paces down the road.
Frank?
Just a quick question. So I don't quite understand the tribal courts or very much about them, but are some of your participants in the criminal system because the tribal courts put them there, or is it always the state and federal courts?
Yes. State and federal, generally speaking. So California is a public law 280 state, which is different from, depending on the count, only 10 states in the country are public law 280, which means that at one point the federal government said, we're going to let the state handle stuff. So if you've seen the movie Wind River, for example, they bring in the FBI, they bring in the feds, that's who you go to for help, right? In a public law 280 state, the state and the county are the jurisdictions that are responsible for criminal offenders or charging and sentencing, things like that. Our court is trying to build our resources. We have a civil court as well as wellness courts, family courts, but for us it's usually a process of reclaiming our people from the criminal justice system and walking with them, even as you have to be their probation officer and things like that. Nonetheless, if you're, if the county lets you, which is a whole other conversation.
Yes.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I think it was really worthwhile that you take this subset that's already very criminalized, people who are, a lot of negative things in the media about people. But then at the same time, I know there's a lot of kind of silver lining in that group, the kind of network that you're talking about, and the healing that comes out of that, kind of almost like a consciousness of the fact that you have to change, right, as a person from the inside, and then you can share that with one another.
Yes.
And I'm wondering, is that, is celebrating that or developing that going to be like the next part of the study? Or could it be?
Yeah. Well, that's often a question I get from my people is like how do we get people to stop doing what they're doing? If they're, if they're using, if they're in and out of jail, how do we, because, if there was more Yuroks, maybe I wouldn't have to care, but there's only 6,000 of us. Every one of us counts, right? And there's a, they're like, what do we do? And it's like, well, I actually don't have the answer, because personal agency is so much a big part of this. But from what I've observed, the way that men could hold each other responsible through ceremony, through sweats, through fishing, hunting together. And so yes, I want to be able to study this, but there's also a huge man space component that I really have to be respectful of. Right? The next book is actually going to be the very important women in their lives, but because yes, they are a huge backdrop to this. But it's a growing phenomenon. Some of my guys were only in recovery as recently as the last 5 to 10 years, which seems like a while. But when we think of the peak of the opioid epidemic being 2008, and then the subsequent heroin and things, the fallout from there, I think that's a longitudinal study in the works, if anything. Yeah.
I have a question. It's an analytic question, actually, but I need a little time to develop it. In the presentation, you have this idea that you presented to us about trauma and about the historical legacies of it. Okay. And on one hand, what gets mixed up in it, or isn't separated, let's put it that way, not the word mixed up is too loaded, which doesn't get separated out, is that you have a number of people on a reservation in a tribe, some of whom don't have any of these maladies. And what you haven't presented to us is what's different about them with the history of trauma than the people who succumb to some form of self-degradation. or leaving themselves vulnerable in a labor market because they're drug addicted, or that. So unless we kind of have some idea about what's different about them, it's kind of hard to know what policies might be in place to actually aid the people that need aiding. So what's different about the people? What's different than all the people you showed us, who could have been, in other words, who are success stories? Because you said to us in the beginning, don't let us bring a prejudice in that everybody is drunk on the reservation and everybody's taking drugs. So what's different about the people who don't do any of that and are on the res? And all of us who live on reses know that there are people who exist like that, and as opposed to the people who actually succumb to some kind of, mental illness or a drug addiction or something.
Yes. Leave it to the professor to give me a head scratcher. But I've heard versions of this question before, and so I want to reply for a couple components. First, I guess I push back on the assumption that they are that different from us. I don't want to dig too much into my personal narrative, but in my life, my ACEs score is over a 4. I think I'm a 6 if I'm not mistaken, and my drug of choice is sanctioned by capitalism. I'm a workaholic. I left home at 18. I got fuck out of there, and I still, I'm guilty of that, and I'm not trying to draw from my example, but actually, now this is the article version, and in the book manuscript, right, I get to have chapters and work your way up to it. So I actually opened this chapter with someone who comes from a quote-unquote good family, who even as we all have this multi-generational legacy of trauma, they came from a family that at least didn't beat their wives, for lack of a better example, or things like that. They were a good family, but they too had become mired in this extreme, for them their drug of choice was alcohol, and I'm still working my way through fleshing this out, but that is almost what the reservation effect and the concentrated trauma is, that even if you aren't the one who's using, if I am bound to you with infinite ties, your behaviors fall back on me. And so whether or not I'm the user, the using behaviors have implications for the entire network, right? And now I'm touching kind of a little on addiction studies, but there is literature that says that addiction's a family disease. So even as that one person is the externalizer, this codependency is part of it too. Like there's a multi-layered story here that yes, I did focus on a pretty specific subset of our population. And I don't want to say that it's only specific from the outside looking in, but some of these people, it kind of depends on who you ask and where at the life course they are at too. And something our tribal court really tries to push back on is that no one wanted to be there, whether they're drinking at the rocks in Wichipek, they're at the bottom of the barrel somewhere. Like no one wanted to be that person on the corner. And that actually the differences between me and them are rather small. And that's a little bit on the soapbox because I want to get in theoretical variation and I want to discern that. But I realize now when I push back on that question, I'm pushing back on that underlying assumption that they are that much different from us and that what would help them would not help us too, and vice versa.
Well, we could all be the same as a human. I mean, that's what you're saying. But I'm concerned about your last point about how to make something better.
Yeah.
And so how would I know where to intervene on that? Whether if I don't know. At the level
of the network, not the individuals.
No, but there's got to be some reason. There's some reason why somebody does something X as opposed to Y. And in other words, it doesn't matter what your ACT score or whatever it is that if empirically we find that there's some of them who have a high score and they still don't have any alcohol, none. They don't have any drug abuse. What's different about them? In other words, what is the difference between them? Otherwise, we have this just mass of people who, can't be differentiated.
Yes, but I guess I'm still pushing back at the need to differentiate, because I feel like I'm.
Isn't the difference between, you do have some people, you interact with all these people. Maybe my tribe's different. I got some people who don't touch any of this stuff, okay? And I got people who touch a lot of this stuff. To me, that's a difference. That's the only difference I'm talking about.
Yes.
So I just want to know what it is that makes those people different. I could tell you in my tribe what that is, but I'm not.
Yes.
That's not my. Your research is a different tribe.
It is. It is.
So I was thinking, what's your thoughts on that?
I don't think my answer changes. I think that, you're talking to someone who's only one step removed from these people, quote unquote, and not to say that's your word, but if we're trying to discern a difference between this and that, I don't. And in our network, we don't. We bring someone in closer and we treat them as they're our own, and in a way, there's almost an obfuscating, if I'm saying that word right, an obfuscating of the difference.
Obfuscating.
Yes, I think in one hand, if I was trying to explain why those people did not use drugs, I would be guilty of exceptionalizing in the same way one might say I'm exceptionalizing. And for me, I've chosen to tell the story through the eyes of people who have effectively been written off by policymakers and social scientists alike, but who still are participating in their social networks such that their outcomes matter for the whole. Yeah, and so but I still need to work on this, because there's two questions at play that I think I'm getting caught up in. The personal one and that empirical one is really important.
We've got a couple questions, Deborah, first, and then.
I have a question actually that's coming from someone who's joining us remotely. Liz Johnson asks,
Hi, Liz.
can you speak to the justice framework used within the Yurok Nation and also between the Yurok Nation and the state?
Yes, good question. Yay for Zoom. Yes, so I definitely recommend, if you don't know about it yet, there's a magazine called Bitch Media, I want to say. Our tribal court, we were just featured in it, and restorative justice is in vogue. It's got, there's all kinds of stuff with restorative justice, and I think tribal courts are one of the, big proponents and first proponents, because that's always how we did justice. We, as a village community, if we think of harvest time, whatever we're harvesting, like, it's all hands on deck. We need everybody. And so if me and my neighbor, whose house, like, both our families built this house, plank house in the ground 100 years ago, like, if we have this huge dispute, I can't keep that bad blood going out on the river. Someone could get hurt, right? Like, or what if I decide I don't want to show up and harvest that day, like, because I'm mad at whoever's running it? Like, all these things would have ground a village to a halt. And so there was a very regulated and structured system of settling up and of making things right when something had happened. So much so that banishment or incarceration in the modern day, that would have actually been the last after many, many things that we exhausted first. And so in many ways, it's a complete reconceptualization of justice. And the end goal, something my tribal judge always says, is that Judge Abby always says there's a very short history of punishing people into the right behavior. And I think that's where that element of compassion and bringing someone in as if they were your brother, as if they were your father, like, and giving them the love and support that they need, that's what we've done, and that's what we're trying to do more of. And right now, we work with the state to try and get this going. We have some joint jurisdiction efforts in Humboldt County that have really been taken off. We have family law courts where Judge Abby and Judge Heinrichs from Eureka, Humboldt County jurisdiction, they sit side by side on a bench together. One of the first in the country to do this. And they are hearing family law cases for tribal families and addressing them in the way that our models would say to. And they've actually been so successful, there are non-tribal families who are asking for those same options, and they're starting to use that same curriculum and those same family supports for families of all kinds. And so we see that infusion of Indigenous knowledge taking place. Thank you, Liz, for that question.
Yes.
I was wondering, it's another question about sort of heterogeneity in your population. And in many ways, one of the striking things you talk about is how these men who have been removed from the community, right, and could, under certain theories, be imagined to be excluded, and with capitalism are reintegrated and reclaimed, right? And that's a very striking feature of the community to describe. But people can be integrated in a network and still experience power dynamics within the network. And so I wanted to ask you a little bit about how people might be maybe stratified within these networks and communities, and whether they all equally partake in these supportive exchanges that you described, or if some are, you know, considered less worthy of help, or you know, kept at a distance, considered beyond the pale, or at least less.
No, these are deep questions. I hope I can muster a response, because you know, in a lot of ways, I was just trying to describe the forest, and I've done that. But now we need to know how the forests talk to each other, or the trees. And so, you know, I think it depends, definitely, on the person and the family. This, you know, in a lot of ways, something, you know, I was trying to say a lot. You guys saw I skipped a couple of pages. But one of the things that I realized I left out was that, you know, there's a lot of person to person, right? Like you and I treat you based on how you treated me, and so on and so forth. But what if, you know, what if my tie to you is actually through the fact that our parents used to play those same games, or used to dance the same dances together, or our grandparents even, right? And so there's this kind of family component that I would almost step back so much from saying that there's individual people that are treated differently. I would actually say there's more of a family effect, you know. And I don't want to be sharing too much of our business, because I always try to be really respectful about what I share. But you know, sometimes people do talk about things like good families and bad families, and so even that, you know, that'll be, you know, it's a small town, everybody knows everybody. So when you're reading the newspaper and you're seeing certain last names, you know, you might be shocked, but then what if grandma's like, yeah, they've been in the paper forever, you know? So I feel like there's a component there that is also kind of mediated in this multi-generational, intergenerational component, more so than what any one person did. Because, you know, by that same token, there are people who come from those bad families who go on to do great things and have to, I don't think they would ever distance themselves from their family, but they realize that, you know, their name may or may not come with a certain connotation. But there's so much pride for us in coming from this place that I feel like if there are people who don't get to benefit from these networks, it's people that are not seen as being genuine. So, you know, if you're saying you're clean and you're coming to a ceremony and you're dancing in our ceremony saying you're clean, but then I know for real you're not, because that's a big no-no, and that could endanger the whole ceremony. Like, I might not be willing to engage in a social exchange with you, or not help out and get you a job. But if I know you're really clean, and I don't care how many times you've been in prison, if you really want to stop and you want to find work, your social network will engage for you. You know, I will put with a caveat that I would say sex offenders, generally speaking, probably don't benefit from these same reintegration. And that's obviously a traditional kind of, you know, socially and traditionally supported, I guess. Is that the right word?
Well, our time.
Oh God, do we have time for one more?
We have time for one more.
Okay, I'll try to make it quick. Thank you so much. This was such interesting work. I just wondered, you mentioned your data, and as this is admittedly a self question that is self-interest. I'm wondering how, if the tribe is owning your data, or how you kind of work out data sovereignty issues with your tribe.
Yes. At this point, no, because this was data I did for my graduate studies, my dissertation. But they don't own it, but it's not mine either. It's something we share together, because it's for example, I continue to work with the tribal court even after this project is elapsed, and they always, the project has to end sometime, IRB, there's a cutoff, all that, and so our tribe is still working through those things on our end. I actually, as someone who's like, oh, IRB on this side, I want to start a tribal IRB so that we can start, having those discussions, those negotiations with researchers. What does our data look like, and who owns it? If you want to see a really cool book, check out Salmon and Acorns, Feed Our People by Kari Marie Norgard. And that book actually was, the authorship is both herself and the Karuk tribe. So that's, that was actually really hard to do from what I gathered though. So it's very much an ongoing and growing conversation. It kind of depends on the tribe too and what their research apparatus is. There's not a lot of Yurok PhDs yet, but we're getting there. Yeah.
Well, join me in thanking Professor Joy for